How's it going, you crafty bunch of bakers? Welcome back to another video. Today I'll show you to make a Tangzhong milk bread without kneading. So let's get in the kitchen and get started. Tangzhong is a roux made out of flour and some type of liquid, usually water or milk. A portion of the total flour of a bread recipe is cooked until the starch in the flour becomes gelatinized. The starch in the flour swells up and absorbs much of the cooking liquid. Cooking the flour also weakens the gluten structure, and that makes the bread lighter and fluffier. Weakening the gluten structure and giving the flour the ability to absorb and hold on to more liquid are both great advantages when it comes to bread making. Breads made with Tangzhong are lighter and fluffier while being able to stay that way for longer. It is a simple technique with a great impact, so let's get right to it. Let me show you how it's done. Starting with the ingredients, need some white bread flour, yeast, salt, sugar, milk, butter, and an egg for glazing. As for the equipment, we'll need a bowl, scales, a dough scraper, a temperature probe, a brush, a small pan and a whisk for cooking the Tangzhong, and we'll need a bread tin for baking. I'm using my USA Pan Pullman tin. It is larger than a regular 2-pound loaf tin, but this bread will fit in a regular 2-pound loaf tin. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's start the process. And the first step is to make the Tangzhong. Combine the flour and the milk in a small pan, whisk them together, set the pan on high heat, and cook the mix for around 5 minutes until it becomes thick. You want to stir it continuously so it doesn't stick to the bottom of the pan. Often Tangzhong would be made with a ratio of 1:5, and that is 1 part flour, 5 parts liquid. I'm keeping it simple in this recipe, so I'm using all the liquid of the recipe in the Tangzhong, so we don't need to weigh out anything separately. Because of that, the ratio of this mix is 1:6, and I don't believe it makes any difference. And if it does, I can take a slight trade-off if I can simplify the recipe. It's worth to know that you don't need to boil this mix, only cook it until it becomes nice and thick. The starch will begin to gelatinize at a pretty low temperature of around 65 degrees Celsius or 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Once your mix is nice and thick, transfer it to a bowl, but make sure you weigh it. We need to account for evaporation. Top up the missing amount with more milk. Now the Tangzhong needs to be left to cool down. To make my life easier later on when mixing the final dough, I like to add the salt, the sugar and the butter to it now and mix those ingredients in until everything's nice and smooth so I don't have to deal with them later. Once the mix is ready, cover it up and leave it to cool down completely. It'll take around 2 to 3 hours. I left mine overnight. When you first remove the lid, scrape the liquid off of it with a spatula and add it back to the roux. Then give it a good mix and measure its temperature. You don't want to use it if it's still too warm. Since I left it on the table all night, it cooled down to room temperature, which was around 22 degrees Celsius or 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Pretty much perfect for a recipe like this. As I mix the dough, it will warm up slightly. Okay, now we can move on to finishing the dough. There are only a couple of ingredients left to add. First, add the yeast, give it a quick mix, then add the remaining flour. Grab your dough scraper and mix it to the dough. And if you're struggling with the scraper, finish it off by hand. This dough is not sticky at all, it's extremely easy to handle. Once it's fully mixed, place it in a clean bowl and take its temperature. We're aiming for around 24 degrees Celsius or 75 degrees Fahrenheit. If your dough is slightly warmer, it will ferment more rapidly. If it's cooler, it will take longer. Adjust the fermentation times accordingly. At this temperature, bulk fermentation took around an hour and a half. We are giving the dough a fold, about 45 minutes in. Folding will help with developing the gluten structure a little bit more. It will also equalize the temperature of the dough and make it nice and smooth. To perform the fold, place the dough on the table with the smooth side down, flatten it out, fold the edge over the middle, go around in a circle to reach the point where it started. Then flip it smooth side up again, tighten it against the table, and back in the bowl it goes. Cover it up, leave it to ferment for another 45 minutes. With the bulk fermentation over, we can divide this dough into 4 equal pieces and then pre-shape it. We want the segments of our loaf to be nice and uniform, but after dividing, the dough is all kinds of wonky. In order for us to get a nice smooth finish, first we'll pre-shape it, we'll leave it to rest, and then we'll do the final shaping. And of course at this point you can decide to make something else from this dough. You can do individual rolls, you can do braided loaf, you can make the loaf out of 2 segments instead of 4, or you could make some tear and share mini rolls. That is all up to you. Okay, to do the pre-shaping, take the piece of dough, flatten it out, fold the edge over the middle, go around a circle until you reach the point where you started, then flip it smooth side up again and then tighten it against the table, just as you did with the fold earlier. Cover up the dough balls and leave them to rest for 30 minutes. This is quite a long resting stage, but they are quite tight, so they need it. Before I perform the final shaping, I'll prepare the baking tin by brushing it with butter. But don't get me wrong, this bread is not going to stick to the tin. I just want the crust of it to get a nice toasty buttery finish. You could use oil or some other type of fat for a different type of finish. Okay, it's final shaping time. We're going to make little tight rolls. Give the dough ball a light dusting of flour, flatten it out, cross the two sides over the middle, and then roll the piece of dough up, starting from the top down to the bottom. It's pretty tight, so you're only going to be able to roll it 2 or 3 times. And speaking of tightness, you can certainly increase the hydration of this dough. If you want this bread to be extra large with a slightly more open crumb, simply add more liquid to the recipe. Right, once you have shaped up your rolls, pick them up one by one, make sure again that the seam is nice and secure, and arrange them side by side in your baking tin. And now it's final proofing time. Cover the dough so it doesn't dry out and leave it to rise. You want it to more than double in height. That took me around 2 hours at around 24 degrees Celsius or 75 degrees Fahrenheit. To speed up the process, you could place the loaf in a warmer area. During the final hour of fermentation, you want to preheat the oven to 160 degrees Celsius, 320 Fahrenheit, fan on. And that'll be 180 degrees Celsius, 355 degrees Fahrenheit, fan off. There's only one thing left to do before we bake this thing. We need to give it a nice egg glaze. Don't go too heavy though, because it will drip down and end up on the bottom of the loaf. If you're not a fan of egg, you can use a different type of glaze, or don't glaze it at all. You could also sprinkle the loaf with some sesame seeds perhaps. If you see large bubbles on the surface, puncture them using a temperature probe. Otherwise they may blow up in the oven and the loaf may turn out a little bit funky looking. Right, let's get this bad boy in there. The initial bake will take around 30 minutes. After the first 30 minutes of baking, gently remove the loaf from the tin and then place it back into the oven for another 15 minutes of baking. This will finish off the crust nicely. It will ensure that it's browned nice and evenly on all sides. As a final touch, I like to give this bread a light coating of oil. It'll make it even shinier, it'll soften the crust even more, and it will stay looking good for longer. Of course this is optional, you can just leave it as it is. But there you have it, that's how you make a Tangzhong milk bread without kneading. There was a recipe for this type of bread on my channel already, but that was way back in the day when I used to be all about hand kneading. Nowadays, giving the dough a fold or two is my preferred method, and it works wonders. I'm never kneading bread dough again. Someone recently asked me about the no-knead version of this recipe, and that is why I decided to redo my old milk bread recipe to suit my new method. And as you can see, the result is a super light and puffy milk bread, which involves very little work to make. And if you want me to convert more of my old recipes, let me know. I have redone a good chunk of them already, but I'm sure there's a few which I'm forgetting about. And if you're a fan of milk breads and such, then head over to the enriched dough playlist. It's full of recipes like this. And let me know what you thought of this recipe down in the comment section. That'll be it for today. As ever, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.